Outer nomadic anarchy. Man, just think about those words for a second. Imagine standing out there on a desolate rock, completely surrounded by a thrashing, limitless ocean that just flat out defies all human logic and control. That's the raw, mythic environment we're stepping into today. It's a place where the neat, orderly lines of human engineering are constantly under siege by these ancient primordial forces.
So, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating scholarly case study, the 1898 Rathlin Light Incident. Now, at first glance, the historical reports from this isolated lighthouse read exactly like your classic Victorian ghost story. But as we'll see through the lens of modern analysis, it's actually something much, much deeper. We're going to examine this not as a simple haunting, but as a total, catastrophic breakdown of Jungian psychology.
Section 1, the light of Victorian logic. Let's look at the baseline state.
To really understand how the keeper's mind unraveled, we first need to look at his baseline state of reality. By day, this lighthouse was a sterile instrument of Victorian engineering. It literally represented the triumph of human reason and duty over the chaotic sea. But as soon as the sun went down, the reality of the situation transformed into a psychic landscape of the collective unconscious. His waking, conscious logic was entirely eclipsed by the chaotic, untamed depths of his own mind. It's like flipping a switch from safety to sheer terror. And this transformation brings us to a really critical concept, the uncanny. You've probably felt it. It's that deeply disturbing feeling that creeps up when the familiar suddenly becomes strangely alien. The keeper lived in a world completely defined by this psychological disturbance. His lighthouse, his sanctuary, his supposedly safe hearth was slowly turning against him. The walls hadn't changed, the beacon hadn't moved an inch, and yet everything felt fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong.
Moving on to Section 2, confronting the Jungian shadow, let's dive into the core conflict here.
With his environment feeling increasingly alien, the sheer crushing weight of his isolation forced a severe internal conflict. To make sense of this, we need to define the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is basically the repressed, inferior part of the psyche. It's the dark half of ourselves that we actively try to silence, often by burying ourselves in work. And that's exactly what was happening here. The keeper wasn't just fighting the harsh coastal elements out there on the rock, he was actively suppressing his own internal shadow, desperately trying to keep it in check through his rigorous, repetitive lighthouse duties. But when those duties inevitably start to fail, the isolation acts like a giant pressure cooker. It forces the collective unconscious to just bubble up to the surface. The very beacon he was supposed to tend transformed into what's called a moral uncanny, a glowing manifestation of moral dread that mirrored his own fractured sense of self. The environment itself literally morphed into a reflection of his collapsing ego. Which brings us to Section 3, the Banshee's internal siege. The projection begins.
Now we hit the primary threat in the keeper's narrative, the banshee. But listen, we aren't talking about a literal ghost rattling chains here. Her arrival was an eruption into the known world, a massive, devastating projection of the keeper's suppressed fears. In Jungian terms, this mysterious feminine force actually acts as his anima. She's a redoubtable goddess of the underworld who utterly shattered his desire to know and his ability to control his environment.
She basically forced him into a direct confrontation with this Hades in the depths of the human mind. What a line, right? The keeper's carefully constructed persona as this brave savior of the sea was violently torn to pieces. He was thrown headfirst into a terrifying archetypal abyss that existed entirely within his own psyche. It's absolutely crucial to remember that the siege he experienced was an internal scientific dilemma of the soul. Picture that classic maritime symbol for a second. His practical tiller, his very mechanism for steering and control, was completely lost to the tide of primordial influence. All those neat practical tools of Victorian logic, they're entirely useless against the overwhelming wave of the collective unconscious. Section 4, Surviving the Archetypal Abyss. The psychic climax. He found himself encountering a dead space older than the sun and moon. Just take a moment to really absorb the incomprehensible scale of that quote. We're not talking about a simple bump in the night. These were ancient psychic forces that absolutely dwarfed human existence, rising up to swallow his consciousness whole. Ultimately, as you know, the keeper fled. But we have to realize his flight wasn't an act of physical cowardice. It was an act of inaction turned into pure survival. He came to the terrifying realization that hard work, vision, and human engineering simply cannot solve an eruption of the unconscious. He was up against threats that were, until that exact moment, previously unimaginable to him.
This whole parable of Rathlin Island really exposes the dangerous fragility of the human moral compass when it's faced with the uncanny. Existing at this dizzying altitude of the mind demanded a radical shift in perspective, what's described as a general change of attitude, just to maintain a basic grip on sanity.
Because here's the thing, by refusing to acknowledge the shadow within his own light, he essentially forced that shadow into a spectral revolt. His very denial is exactly what conjured the ghostly army at his door. You literally cannot just lock the dark away. It will invariably find a way to manifest. Let's step back for Section 5, the cost of individuation.
At the absolute core of this analysis is the Jungian concept of individuation. It's the lifelong process of integrating one's light and dark halves. And this, sadly, is exactly what the Keeper failed to achieve during his isolated time on the rock. He clung so desperately to the light, outright refusing to acknowledge the dark.
Because, let's be honest, true integration is rarely a pleasant experience. It often requires a willing descent right into the dystopian universe of the unconscious. You have to somehow naturalize the terrifying truth of your own mind. But the Keeper couldn't do this. He completely failed to join the familiar, logical light of his intellect with the alien deep of his psyche.
He fled because he finally saw the truth of his situation. He realized that the mighty Victorian light he served so loyally was ultimately insignificant. It was merely a shape appearing and reappearing among shapeless things. It was just this temporary cross of pale pattern trying to hold back a massive, untamable forest of gray.
The Keeper's story remains an anchor for the lost, leaving us with a grim, undeniable reminder. Until we face the abyss within, will our beacons only ever serve to call our demons home? It's a genuinely chilling thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the light you cast in the dark.